Hi, everybody. Can you hear me on here? Good. Great. Thank you so much, Sam. Appreciate the music. Can we get a hand for her? That was beautiful. A quick few orders of business before we start. For people that are here who need credit for attendance, there are Slido codes on the walls up there. Also, something we'll probably mention before we leave again, but there will be a reception after this with food and beverages if you'd like to meet our speaker, Elizabeth, afterwards, which I highly recommend. But before we get to that, for this lecture, this is our 5th installment this semester. It's a very special one for a lot of reasons. I'm gonna introduce a faculty member who will introduce our speaker. I'm probably uniquely qualified for that. My name's Sam Johnson, I should say first. I help run the speaker series program. I'm like an assistant to Julie Coleman and Deandra Harps. We also get a lot of help from several faculty members. But the faculty member who's going to introduce our speaker is Todd Johnson, who's my dad. I have to actually go back one step further before I talk about him, because I think it's when you're in this building at USU, it's against the law to, if you bring up my dad and you don't bring up his older brother, I think they kick you out of the program. His older brother, my uncle, is Craig Johnson, who's sitting right here. And I'll just tell you briefly about him and his legacy here. He taught in this department at USU for 42 years. Kind of unprecedented tenure, yeah. We, in that amount of time, he's taught thousands of students, one of whom anonymously endowed the department to sponsor an annual Craig Johnson lecture. And that's what this is today. So it's extra special. A brief bit about him. He has a master's in landscape architecture. He has a master's in science for wildlife sciences. He's a licensed landscape architect in 3 states, Utah, Minnesota, Idaho. Great. He's won Teacher of the Year numerous times. In 1982, he was awarded the ASLA, was it Distinguished Service Award, I think is what it's called. And in 1988, he was awarded the Utah State University International Teacher of the Year Award. He's been project lead on countless ASLA award-winning projects. The list goes on. That's a heavily abridged version. And on a personal note, I think he played a big part in my dad getting into the field as well. My dad attended USU as an undergraduate when he was teaching here. And I think by association also is a big reason why I'm pursuing a career in it as well. So he started a family vocation. A little bit about my dad. So he went from here as an undergraduate to the Graduate School of Design at Harvard for a master's degree. From there, he co-founded a firm called Civitas with some of his grad school buddies. And for a number of years after that, served as a partner at Design Workshop in Denver, where he led many award-winning projects. And I don't like to brag about my dad. I like to brag about my uncle. But he's had quite a storied career as well that spanned, in practice, spanned probably 30 to 40 years. He did in 2004, I'll mention, he was selected to be a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. And to complete the circle, is now teaching at the LAEP department here. I'm sure most of you have had a chance to meet him. So anyway, without further ado, we'll bring up my dad, Todd Johnson.
Thanks, Sam and Julie. This is really all about this lady. Elizabeth Kennedy is here because she is a distinguished landscape architect that received the President's Award last evening for the state of New York, American Society of Landscape Architects. But that's not why she's here specifically either. My brother, who's the name of this lecture, had an ethos, and it was formed early in his life. And he's a nature boy, and he believes in the optimization of non-speaking and speaking populations. So that means all critters, animals, plants, and people. And so he taught that and imbued this department with that philosophy. The connection that I have to Ms. Kennedy is Elizabeth is through Karen Phillips, who is a classmate of mine. And when we talk about equity, when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about ethos, that's what's on our website. And so she started a practice that you would call a critical practice, critical idea practice focused on issues and solving problems of marginalized populations, green infrastructure, sustainability, and that whole set of issues that we are right in the middle of. The last couple of years have brought to attention many things that have been fomenting for years, for decades. And so we made a commitment as a department to embrace this set of issues and investigate these issues further. And we want to invite people in who have led the way. So for a Black woman to start a firm 27 years ago in New York City, one of the toughest towns in the world, and to sustain to this day and be awarded in these ways is a distinguished honor, and we are honored to have you here. Please welcome.
Whether or not you can hear me this way. Great, 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 great. And I promise you a lot of this will be spontaneous and off the cuff. Last night I had a very late night. Karen, former Commissioner Mitchell Silver, and I received awards from the New York City chapter of the ASLA. Mine was for leadership. And what I hope to talk about today, and even more importantly, invite those of you who are going to the conference to attend our very badly publicized Inside the LA Studio workshop on Sunday, the 21st, where actually we will go into more depth about this question of ethos. What I thought I would do, first of all, I want to say that when I finally got through all of the emails, let me step back for a second. George Floyd's murder, I'll be very candid, sparked a national debate about social justice. And suddenly the work that I and a few other practitioners were doing became worthy of note. And this is the 42nd of 43 talks that I'll do on this topic in the past 10 months. And they were all different. So what I thought I would share with you today is something that's tailored to the interests of this program and to the focus of Craig Johnson. I hope I do it justice. Please feel free to ask a lot of questions because I'm much better responding, particularly after a night of drinking gin. Today's talk is a full-scale mock-up. And part of the reason why it's full-scale mock-up is because I was in the middle of doing submittals reviews when the invitation came, but also in thinking about doing what we've had to do for the past 27 years, actually stepping back and trying to see if there was a methodology, if there was an actual approach. And what how that could be shared in terms of conversation. I confessed to somebody who's been my right hand for a while that I said, we've been making this up as we go along. And I wanted to share that to let the future of landscape architecture know you can make it up as you go along and do good work. Okay. And that's really important. I got 5 questions in the invitation email, and I really appreciated that, because a lot of times people ask you to speak and then they just trust that you'll know what the topic should be. But this helped me sort of be very focused about this conversation. So how is EKLA and the work we do relevant? I think I can demonstrate that pretty easily because of the market that we're in. What visual examples of work show problem-solving approaches in the creative process, highlighting attitudes that support collaborative behavior. Right up front, I can say that, in case you haven't guessed, I am a woman of African descent. I will share up front that my cultural narrative is not African-American. My parents were immigrants. I am the daughter of Jamaicans, and I lived in Jamaica for 8 years. And Jamaica is, as my aunt said, your ancestral home. So, and this is important because people assume that because I'm a woman of African descent, that I understand all issues having to do with African Americans, and I don't. What attributes, or I would say traits, are needed for this work? Which of these qualities can be taught? Some can, some can't. And what are the results? So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about us. And when I was collecting unemployment and wondering what to do, I was working for a construction and development company that went into bankruptcy, and when they reorganized, they didn't invite me along. So I thought, well, okay, now's the time. And I started in high-end residential work, and that's kind of important later. But segued pretty soon after that into public sector work. And we do, frankly, whatever comes our way to pay the bills. So we do stormwater quality management that results in parkland rejuvenation. We do construction upgrades of other award-winning designs that actually happen to be failing. In this instance, this is a Julie Bargeman design. It's a beautiful design, but it was not ADA accessible. So we were working on doing something within a 4-inch profile to make it work all the way around, and we did that. This happens to be in the Brooklyn Navy Yard where our offices are located. Harlem Stage in New York, where the 135th Street Gatehouse was converted into performing arts space. There's this, as you can kind of tell, it's an extremely sloped site. And what we tried to do was use what I call the Renaissance trick. Maybe this will do it, to provide ADA or universal accessibility around the tower. We worked on the African Burial Ground National Monument. I suspect that this is going to come up again in the presentation. To work with the monument architect, Rodney Leon, who's a good friend, on the interpretation of the story of the Collect Pond. And if any of you know New York, the Collect Pond was actually a freshwater pond just north of Wall Street in what was Manhattan and now is Manhattan. Over time, it became industrialized in its use, but it was the place where enslaved and free Africans, and yes, New York was a slave state, were buried. And it was rediscovered, although in terms of oral histories and traditions, it was always known about. It was rediscovered when the Ted Weiss building was to be constructed. And these 7 mounds that you see here were our recognition that the topography of the Collect Pond has been lost in the urbanization of Manhattan. And the remains that were disinterred to build the Ted Weiss courthouse, after their forensic analysis at Howard University, were returned to the site in 7 sarcophagi that were carved in Ghana. And in the work that we've done on burials, you know that over time, the wooden caskets decay and there's a collapse of the lens. And so what we wanted to do was to highlight the reinterment zone in such a way that when the wood collapsed, you would actually then have the modeling of the collect pond. But the National Park Service felt differently. Some of the commemoration. We got a call one day, we have a large green roof. This at one time was the largest green roof completed in the 5 boroughs of Manhattan. It's over 2 acres. It was the first completed for any federal facility in the country. It was entirely an experiment for the USPS, and now it's being redone by another consultant, but this was our. But that PhD in extensive green roofs allowed us to work with the Brooklyn Navy Yard to develop the prototype for urban agriculture. And what we did in this instance, this is actually a perched wetland. It's designed to detain the first inch of rainfall in a storm event. It became the standard for projects, urban agriculture projects funded by the Department of Environmental Protection until the technology changed and more of the rain store technologies happened. But educational facilities, we do compromise our values and do airports from time to time. Because these actually do pay the bills. And we also work as part of large teams on urban redevelopment projects. I won't say renewal, but redevelopment. We were not selected for this project. David Ajayi's team did win that one. But as you can see, the landscape architectural scope, including a working urban farm in a Flatbush, Brooklyn community, was very extensively incorporated in this idea. So to go to relevance, 99.99999% of what we do is in the public sector. We don't do any residential work now. But in preparing for this lecture, I was thinking, you know, the residential work gave us a certain tool set that actually kind of distinguishes EKLA's practice from others. And then that residential design actually requires a fairly intimate relationship with your client. And there's some certain assumptions in that relationship. People who hire you to do high-end residential, particularly very high-end residential, they are operating from a set of psychological values that you have to interpret in order to develop and deliver the swimming pool of their dreams, because it has to be the swimming pool of their dreams, right? And that same skill set that allows you to engage with a homeowner is actually the skill set that we translate into working with communities. So when people say, oh, you know, I'm very confused and surprised by that, because it's a tool set that's readily available and it operates in another area of the profession very readily. But we also, because we work in the public sector, things tend to have a civic value. And so it's very easy to see whether or not we have relevance because we are delivering for the public good, right? We also happen to work, because we are engaged as sub-consultants, particularly in New York, large projects are assigned an architect or an engineer with the capacity to run the project. And then smaller consultants, sometimes not smaller, but other consultants are brought to the table and coordinated through that process to deliver a project. And in this instance, this is actually under construction. This is the Peninsula, which was a re-envisioning of the infamous Spofford juvenile detention facility in the Bronx. It's a 5-acre site. And I saw somebody say the landscape was 1 acre. No, I think the landscape is actually 60% of the footprint, but we'll find out, and I'll send an email to confirm that. But all the open space, all the green roofs, that's ours. So this is phase 1 and phase 2 of the project. Right now, phase 1 which are these two buildings are actually under construction, and that's kind of cool to see happening. Very much a hardscape project because it is the public face of it is more street side. Now, what I didn't mention in all of this is that there's over 50 feet of grade change on this site. And so part of the charge of making it an equitable space means that it also has to be universally accessible. And we have pretty much succeeded in making universal access everywhere except in that center stair, which serves also as seating. Am I going backwards? No, I'm sorry. As you can see, there's a high level of representation involved, particularly in the submissions. And I'm here to tell you this has nothing to do with us. Okay? This is where we live. And I thought this would be important to share also because one of the things that we have to do is communicate, first of all, explore ideas very quickly and then communicate those ideas very quickly to clients. We meet weekly on this project. So after struggling with a level of 3D representation that could capture what it is that we wanted to look at quickly and in an iterative way, in other words, we're looking at multiple concepts. What we would do is use the architectural model to mass out the space and then explore the old-fashioned way. So I insist in my office that people draw. That takes a lot of resistance because a lot of particularly entry-level people are very comfortable using digital tools, but we draw. And so this allows us to really sort of poetically examine the quality of the space that we're proposing and then advance and make decisions as we go. So generally, our collaborative style happens to tie into multiple iterations, quick adaptation, a lot of discussion. And generally, I would say that most of the collaboration actually happens between the design team. Even at Spofford, which I just showed, there wasn't the level of client engagement that we had on this project, the Weeksville Heritage Center. I've been on this project for 22, 23 years in different capacities. And I kicked off this series of speaking engagements. I was asked by Weeksville's historic preservationist to do a presentation with her about the landscape escaping, okay? Because what we found over time is that everything that we thought of in the design phase, none of this happens. And so the issue for us has been whether or not Weeksville has successfully served its clients in ways that we never imagined, but we were able to facilitate this through the basis of design. So we didn't think that young children would jump down into the high grass, but of course it's irresistible. We didn't imagine that dance troupes would come to explore the issue of Black male bodies in space and use that same grass field as part of the expression. What we did do is look for the poetic elements of the history of Weeksville that would shape our response to the site and convey what this area in central Brooklyn actually felt like at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. This early atlas shows that this part of the Jamaica Bay actually saltwater wetland dendritic pattern, the Fresh Creek, actually extended, first of all, as a Native American trail, but then, let me make sure it's up here, as what became known as the Hunterfly Road. Weeksville was a community that was founded in 1838, was named for a man named James Weeks, with the African-American tradition of place naming after important people. I started by saying New York was a slave state. New York ended slavery at the end of the 18th century, but didn't fully emancipate the enslaved until 1827. And that change in land use I'm going to put this in a very sort of strange way. Much of Kings County, which we now know of as Brooklyn, was put into production for dairy production. And when enslavement ended, Kings County then became the #1 producer of fresh vegetables in the country. And you would think that from going from animal husbandry to vegetable production would actually require more labor, not less. And in reading an archaeological summary of another related site, the archaeologist noted that when the market for slaves ended, for the enslaved ended, because the end of slavery was coming, this is what caused the shift. That actually the dairy farming was like the extra, the business was actually enslavement. So the economy shifted from enslavement, not dairy cattle, but enslavement, to vegetable farming. And with that, the Dutch were in a position actually to greatly reduce their land holdings. And with that came a huge town building boom throughout Kings County, Queens County, Long Island. And with that, African-American communities also began to spring up. Weeksville was one of them. You can see in Francis Guy's painting, A Snowy Day in Brooklyn. This is not the best image of it, but the extent to which Africans, both enslaved and free, were part of the New York landscape. And by 1827, you can still see that parts of Brooklyn still remained rural. The Hunterfly Road houses were actually 4 structures that are now listed on the National Register of Historic Places and our New York landmarks that were occupied all the way through the 60s. The contemporary Brooklyn grid and the farm grid didn't coincide. And so you can see in the landscape interpretation for the Hunterfly Road houses that the farm grid that aligned with these historic houses here was picked up in the interpretive design as a means of first orienting and expressing the difference in the two geospatial organizations. This red line is actually the path of the Hunterfly Road, and you can see that as it passed these, the older structures, that these are actually off-grid. The grid shift is part of the storytelling. So our concept for this sort of divided the landmarked site from the interpretive site. We did some very, I want to say, painterly things in order to help Weeksville tell its story. When viewed actually from Buffalo Avenue, even more so than one of these 2 programmatic lawns, which are sort of extensions of the modern architecture, we established a foreground, midground, and background. We used grading to do this. The site naturally slopes from this high point, 86 down to 80. And what we did in order to frame this meadow, okay, is we actually cut against the slope, right? So, oops. In modeling this, what we did was we created an edge here that would define the foreground. We created a mound to create the midground, and the historic houses are actually the background. We tested this all in SketchUp. And you can see the construction taking place that looks surprisingly like the model. We, again, use these to test our concepts, and you can see at the end how these relationships actually work. Now, this subtlety is so successful that the current director asked me, well, you know, why do we have that mound in the middle of the landscape? And I was just like, if you cut that out, you have eliminated a sense of sequence in approaching the site. And one of the things that we really enjoy is that people go and they try and capture their experience of the landscape. And this is one of the ways in which this dialogue continues. Even when you go, if you Google the Weeksville Heritage Center, you see a lot of amateur photography that sort of picks up on what's done there. We didn't anticipate that the landscape would be used as part of a fashion show, but the designer Pyre Moss launched his first collection through Weeksville staging. Another form of the dialogue is the artist Maria Teresa Alves has a series called Ballast Flora, Seeds of Change, Ballast Flora, where she has these installations that investigate invasive species, the introduction of invasive species in the ballast of ships that were involved in trade during the period of enslavement. And what we did was Weeksville reached out to us and asked us if we would actually direct this installation. And so we actually built the maquette and had her approve it, and then printed everything at full scale and worked with Weeksville to both grow the weed seeds, right, and engage their kids. We work with universities who find the site compelling. This is Parsons School of Design that was looking to provide a shelter for an agroponic farm. I'm sorry that this is so blurry. I think, you know, it's multiple iterations of the actual image, but our job was to make sure that what was proposed by them was sympathetic both to the historic houses and the historic landscape. And it was interesting to see how the poetics of both, you know, continue to influence dialogue over generations. I'll jump ahead here because in having these dialogues and in maintaining a 20-year conversation with Weeksville about its space, as a practice, you want to continue to do things like this. And we served as a consultant to the New York City Department of Parks, which wanted to know how to interpret the remains of a burial ground that was underneath one of their playgrounds. And throughout New York City, it turns out that there's a lot of African enslavement burial sites underneath publicly owned land. So we helped them develop the brief, which is looking at a place as is resonant regardless of prior. In other words, resonant to the visitor, regardless of prior experience, a place that you open your heart to as a visitor, a place where you understand the connection to the history and future, a place of peace and a place of honor. Now, in doing this, we were exploring with them how as I said, how the footprint of contemporary development had impacted burials there. And they did do, I'll go back for a second. They did do archaeology and actually found remains on the site. One of the things that we had to do with them is actually explore the issue of commemoration, explore memorialization. It's actually not a simple issue. You don't wake up one day and decide, all right, this is what we're going to do. And I actually included this because this was a discussion that we had with another client about the process and what symbolism and the approach to interpretation in the landscape of narratives actually would and would not involve. This again was Rodney Leon at the UN this time, interpreting the Middle Passage and the World Trade Center memorials to show what the range of, I want to say, options are to look at historical and commemorative storytelling on the site. And what you didn't want, what you wouldn't want in terms of the interpretation of form that something like the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin becomes a place for parkour and things like that. So we were proposing an upcoming workshop in terms of this dialogue to review different approaches to African-American commemoration and trying to elicit feedback, because what we did find in Weeksville was that in the course of the design, very protracted design process, there was a lot of in-depth discussion about the history of that particular community, to the extent to which it became, as I say, a poetic sort of force within the design. And this sort of transcended the process of relying on programming to make space. We actually, if you look at the design or revisit the design, there's very little actual programming. There are certain circulation elements, but nothing is didactic. And this was intentional. In working with New York City Parks, what we came to understand, and I should say that Weeksville was a story of post-enslavement history. The Sankofa Park was a story that was more focused on enslavement. And so the extent to which the Brooklyn landscape was actually shaped by Africans is something that I don't think is understood in the city or understood commonly at all. But the enslaved essentially built Southeast Brooklyn. And we were trying to identify and suggest ways of reclaiming the environmental conditions and the spirit of place that existed more than 100 years ago in a place that has now been heavily urbanized, and identify which of those conditions could remain on a site that was in the middle of Brooklyn. And where we were with this was the flatness, the quality of light, the extensiveness of the sense of scale of the landscape, and whether or not other interpretations like patterning would come into the story. And I'm truncating this because when this was prepared, we didn't have permission to share the design that they asked us to develop, because they actually took a different approach at the end of the process. But we felt that we had fulfilled our contractual obligation, actually, which was to help them interpret this story. So how, to go back to those points that I was making, how these qualities could be captured in the site that New York City had already established a footprint on, and where this was going. That's where we were, and we don't have that. But we were trying to show how the process of working with parks could actually inform another interpretation site where the scope of the work was actually to engage the community. And so we were talking about how we wanted to emphasize narrative and the emotional aspect, the qualitative aspects of research, considering that half of it would be secondary and half of it would be primary in terms of engagement and feedback. So one workshop would be to hear stories and histories. The second workshop would be to revisit those stories and histories to see how they could be interpreted. The third workshop was to look at the interpretations and trade-offs, because you never have carte blanche on a project, ever, right? Which of the stories could be conserved? Which of the stories, gave you, I want to say, brought things together in such a way that the interpretation hinged on that narrative? How this could be presented to the public, to analyze the public response, and preparing a draft. And the reason why I'm actually closing with this image is because we have tried, with very limited success, to expand the approach to the formalized process of charretting and community engagement by not just doing what I refer to as the shopping list approach, which is you get everybody in the room, you get a bunch of stickies, you put up a map, and you say, okay, what do you want? We want to understand why people want certain things. We don't go for the what at EKLA, we go for the why. And so the why comes out of the more informal discussions and the less objective responses to the work, and how that then begins to inform the formal responses, which is our job, would be the next step. And this not so young man now, Kamal Lare, actually was a docent at the Tenement Museum in the city of New York. And if you know about the Tenement Museum, you know that it's actually a building that was conserved on the Lower East Side, and different apartments in the building are restored to depict the lives of different communities at that time. So Jewish, Italian, and while Kamal was a docent there, one young woman asked him, a little girl asked him, she said, "We're the Black people." And that shocked him, because he himself, who was working there, didn't know. And he went on to do, on his own, to develop an entire research-backed tour, where he took me and Karen, right? We went one fall evening, and we only walked around Washington Square. And we came to understand in that very evocative conversation the history of Dutch enslavement in New York, and how Wall Street drew the line that where we understand as the Village was 5 points, where the Collect Pond was, the African Burial Ground National Monument, was known as the land of the Blacks. And Dutch enslavement differed from English colonial enslavement in that the Dutch had a system of half freedom. Over time, people could earn half freedom. They could farm. And so when you look at historical maps and you see these farms north of Wall Street, those are actually farms by partially and formerly enslaved Africans. And they were there because they were the buffer between the colonial colony to the very southern tip of Manhattan and the pissed off Lenape who were further north. Okay, so Kamal, he gives this very sort of hip hop interpretation of 17th century history, that people who have joint problems, knee problems, hip problems, we can walk around and and he brings it alive. And the tool here, the issue of the attributes and can this be taught, is the tool to introduce the work and disciplines of other experts and practitioners to the design process, to the design research process, in a way that it is accessible to the people that you're serving. So when Kamal comes and he gives a story about enslavement and settlement in New York, he elicits from the community emotional responses that we just sit and write down. Okay, I'm now open to questions.
Okay, that was such an. I think everybody in this room is now going to go find your other 42 talks you did this year. We're going to open it up to questions. If anybody on Zoom has questions, please send them in the chat box, and Sam will let me know about them. But I'll start with questions in the room. Okay.
I really appreciated how you showed how some of your designs were used by the public after you created them. I think it's great to see that you still have your finger on the pulse of things you've done. And I'm curious about, is there a way in your designs to plan for unexpected uses? I think that those two examples you showed, the dance troupe and the fashion show, are incredible, and clearly they were inspired to use them. I wonder if there's a way you can, some way to plan for that. I don't know.
Okay. I am going to start this answer by saying I tend to forget that I have an undergraduate degree in environmental psychology. I never, other than the fact that I tell people that I went to Cornell and this is what I did, I never actually realized that I factor this into the process. And part of the reason why I do that is because, you know, after 4 years and I'm getting ready to graduate and, you know, all of that, my last class in that major was with a man who left Cornell. He didn't get tenure, and he has since been at the University of Kansas, who said, all of this nonsense that you've been learning before, none of this is going to happen. You cannot predict how people are going to react to your design. And, you know, my reaction was, okay, now what, right? And so, I mean, that's a sort of extreme answer. But I can say that in terms of the work of my firm, and we've had clients who've been frustrated with this, we design ambiguity into our solutions. We leave things open to interpretation. We believe in the movable furniture theory. Do you all know the movable furniture theory, right? That if you get to adjust this 6 inches, then it doesn't walk off at the end of the day, right? So we look for those qualities of a site that we think are important to set the context of an activity or a narrative or whatever it is that we're doing, right? So, and by that, one of my former employees used this term and I use it. They said, you know, we don't start out with a program and we end up with a design. We're not too big on place making, we're on place saving. And what we do is that we situate program within the given characteristics of a site. It's a slight difference. So it works with ground up solutions rather than top down solutions, because we have to have a process that allows things to evolve. Now, from a practitioner standpoint, and here's my second shameless plug for the Inside the LA Studio session on the 21st, we have young people who come into the office and they struggle with this. It's not what I did in school. I don't know what you want. And in the course of the discussion, you'll see that you know, that is discussed very candidly in the material that we prepared for that conversation. But I stand by this, that this might be one of the areas where we do differ a bit from architecture, because a site, no matter what it is, has given characteristics. And if you focus and preserve and prioritize and give hierarchy and structure to given characteristics and then see how program fits, we often have a type of sustained activity there that we didn't predict, right? But if you do it the right way, then you also don't get activity that you don't want, because we all know, designs look great on paper. Professionally, we can understand what's going on, and they don't survive, right? The reaction to them is one of abuse, right? They're trashed, they're ignored, they don't function. So we've had both. I mean, not all of our designs have worked. And when I drive past those sites, And to be honest with you, when I see other famous people's designs that don't work, I'm like, yes. But for the ones that do, if you really look at them analytically, you will also find that there is this openness to interpretation, and that allows for the inclusion of what we call equity, right? So that's what you're aiming for if you're working, or if you're looking for what we do.
Any other questions? I'm gonna go with Margot. She was our first speaker this year for our series.
Thank you so much. You mentioned at the beginning that you were given the award with Mitchell Silver, who's a good friend of mine, and I'm a planner, not a landscape architect. But I'd be interested to hear I know his story from his perspective and what he was trying to accomplish with the parks. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how you worked with him on that, because I'll just bet you did.
So I have to be really, careful in the response. No, I mean, no, because it's important to understand that not all projects get built, not all projects, not all client relationships endure, and not all of them are positive, right? You find that somebody said to me once, it's the thing that's about architecture and the AEC industry is that the relationships tend to go on a very long time, and they're often contentious, right? This is a conversation for another day, but this goes to this answer. We got an RFP that was really ambiguously written. And I think it was ambiguously written in part because it was targeting our skill set, but somebody didn't know how to write something. This had to be it was a publicly advertised project, but it was one of those that had our names written all over it. Okay. And when we reviewed the RFP and we responded, our response was, we know you as a client, and we know how you want to be involved in this process. And our role should be to help you interpret this project. And they kept coming back and they said, we want you to design it. And I said, no, you don't want us to design it. Because we otherwise don't work with New York City parks. They have a certain style and a certain vocabulary and a certain approach that would be very difficult for us to meet, right? It's like dating, right? Life is like dating when it's not like sports, if you're not clear about this, right? So you need to be, you could be with, a really handsome person or a really good-looking woman who is a lunatic, and you keep trying to make this work. Or you can grow up and say, okay, I'm going to go with somebody who actually also loves me. Okay, right? So, not all agencies are, that you have good chemistry with. So we first went in, and our role was to help parks understand what's important. So for instance, the idea that the descendant community should have a place where they could quietly sit and connect with the landscape of ancestors was what we felt the design solution should target. How that happens is open to interpretation. Okay, that's where the authorship comes in, right? But at the end of the day, the successful design conveys that in whichever form. So Parks insisted that we design something, and we did design something, and the design was accepted by everybody except the borough commissioner, who had a very specific idea about what the solution should be. Now, people turn to me and say, you need to call Mitch. I'm like, "Uh-uh. No, what is it, the emotional capital? I'm not going to spend it there. We've done what we're supposed to do. I'm not going to now call in a political favor, nor am I going to pit the commissioner against one of his borough commissioners, right? So part of adulthood in practice is learning when to let go, okay? But also in doing so, making sure that what you did deliver on is solid and usable. So we had in our portfolio a design that got to 90%. And it's not on the screen here because they chose a different approach, and it's in the public sector, right? Now that they've begun to publicize that approach, we're in a position to reframe our solution in a certain way, right? But until we can fully organize around that, we don't share that part of the story. But I'm very proud of the work that we did to help them interpret, to help them identify what was important, and to get a dialogue that could be more broadly interpretive of the story of that particular narrative. Yeah.
We're all over. I spotted Dave first, so I'm going to go up here.
Hi there. Two quick things. One is thank you so much for coming, because it's far and you're tired. And it is Utah. You look out the door this way and it's really awesome. Thank you for committing yourself to the public realm, which is not an easy thing to do. So here's my question though. And I love the point you were making about getting to the why, and that it takes effort and you have to get into a more intimate relationship with your client. And I love the analogy of residential clients, actually. I thought that was awesome. But you have to do that, and it takes a lot of time and effort. How do you balance that with your checkbook and keeping the door open and people paid in your firm and all of those other business related things that get in the way sometimes of doing really, really good things?
You do an airport, right? I said you do an airport, right?
Oh yeah, from time to time we do an airport. This is one of the questions that several people have, because they feel that they're unable to they see this as a trade-off. The financial return on that level of investigation. I certainly haven't made any money doing this, but that has more to do with me focusing more on the exploration than on the business. And that's been costly in other ways. So I'll share that, right? But I was actually talking to my family because I got this phone call, tune into 60 Minutes and, mass design and booyah, 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 right? And so I decided to cast some shade. I said, well, you got to really look at their business model. They've set themselves up as a nonprofit, and not just any nonprofit, a very well-heeled nonprofit that can afford to do fantasy projects in poor countries. Now that's colonialism in a way, right? And yes, Zoom I've said this. So it is out, you know, Elizabeth Kennedy cast some shade on mass design. Now, they do great stuff. But one of the things in developing the capacity of this business is making sure that the underrepresented get the resources that they need to command the same level of service that the well-heeled projects get. So part of this is political. Part of this is making sure that the work of Mitch Silver, I mean, you know, that was a no-brainer, what Commissioner Silver did. He basically said, certain communities, when they get their parks done, they get all the goodies. And other communities, when they get their parks done, get none of the goodies, if they get their parks redone at all. This has to do a lot with perception in the marketplace, right? That you can't build high quality in underrepresented neighborhoods because of maintenance. No, you make a commitment to change, because you will find that people do want nice things. They do want good things. They do want the level of respect that is reflected in the level of investment that happens elsewhere. And that's where he's been absolutely successful. But what's great about the commissioner is that he just didn't do this on an emotional sort of, I want to say, forgive me, like a Black man's response to a Black issue, right? He didn't do that. And this is a late night. This is gin. This is, talking. He brought data to the table. He's a planner, and he brought the numbers to the table. And numbers don't lie. There is money in this work. There is money, and it doesn't always have to be grant money. It doesn't always have to be alternative money, but it is a commitment to the equitable distribution of resources in the public realm. That's really what this is about. So, yeah.
Okay, I think so far away. Everyone's so far away.
So you mentioned gardens on the roof, right? And how are they supposed to serve as community gardens? Right. And so just kind of add on to that question, how do you really get a community invested into that? Sorry, so how do you really get a community invested into that garden or that kind of feature? You know, just in my opinion, I feel like it would be tied to the building almost as versus a location. If that makes any sense?
And the developers are, I think everybody can hear me, right? Just for the show, right? The developers have been interested in, I would say, supporting its upkeep through things like job development, through those types of programs, with mixed success. Green roofs are really, 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 really finicky. they are not this sort of, they don't necessarily live up to the fantasy, let me put it that way, right? So as the technology improves, as the growing medium, as the science around the growing medium improves, right? You'll get a better end result, which for projects like the Peninsula, which is essentially at grade, but perched that way, you'll get more engagement of people who want to see people garden for beauty, right? Who want to participate in beauty regardless of what's underpinning it, if that's answering your question. Okay, right. Yes.
I'm so impressed with your courageousness, your honesty, and your articulateness. And you said something earlier about we make it up as we go along. And I think students sometimes don't believe that we were all limited in these capacities at one time. And through the process of doing work, getting paid for it more or less or whatever, we develop the capacity that you now exhibit, such strength and convincing arguments about your work. So give the students confidence that it's a work in progress.
In addition to the type of work that we're known for, I'm also known for staff development. Okay. And a large part of that rests on the traditions of, and I hate this word, but I'll use it, BIPOC, immigrant, and women-led firms, where these companies, first of all, don't necessarily have access to the talent pool that some of the more fabulous white male-led firms have, right? And there's a tradition that not only do you not have the talent pool, but you are also aware that the opportunities that you've had to get the education that leads to your being able to have these businesses is not necessarily universally accessible. So there's this tradition of bringing people along, of reaching back, of setting an example, of inculcating an expectation of excellence in what you do. And a large part of that has to do with the fact that our credibility is so easily and quickly eroded. I've been on projects where I've seen the primes do amazingly dumb things, and they get to show up the next day, and we're 5 minutes late because the subway broke down and people are asking if you're serious about being on this project. So there is a double standard. So that works in our favor because young people are full of ideas. You're fresh, you're energetic, you bring optimism to the table. You see things that we don't always see or we've overlooked. Some of the best ideas in the office have come from young people having a voice in my company. Now, working for me is brutal. Everybody's in the deep end of the pool. And if you're in there with a floaty, I'm gonna stick a hole in it at some point, all right? And you know, I dread going on the internet sometimes to see whether or not I've been listed as one of those people who have reduced people to tears, because I've done this. But I can't tell you the amount of times that people have left the firm either because we had to downsize or because it was like, you know what? I can go over there. I don't have to wait on my paycheck. I can have health benefits. You're a joke. And they leave, because this happens. And then Elizabeth, I know more than the senior people here. Like, yeah, because we're surviving. And so we need you to swim early. So we need two things. We need your freshness. We need your perspective. We need the ideas that you bring to the table. We need your sensitivity. We also need you to be really technically strong. We need you to know about construction. We need you to know how information is managed. We need all these other things. Because this is, at the end of the day, unless we're doing planning projects, which we don't do that many, everything that we're aiming to do has to get built. And so it goes to the question of where in the equation of things do we work out the cost of the investment that we put early in order to arrive at what's important. We have to make it up in the construction documentation phase. So we have to be on it. We have to have people who really understand the principles of construction and the principles of 2D and 3D design. If you don't know it, this is when the Elizabeth that nobody likes to deal with comes out. Right? Because I was going to get a toy Godzilla. And if you went out to lunch and Godzilla was on your keyboard, when you came back or sitting in your chair, waiting, you know that you have to rethink something. but we do it, we make a commitment to people who come in here. We make a commitment that you are going to be solid landscape architects, and that if you embrace the ethos of the firm, you're going to be sensitive landscape architects. That's all we can promise. But I think that's a good deal in exchange for your optimism, your belief in what the client needs, your passion about making a change that's good.
All right, I think we're going to give Elizabeth a little bit of a break from talking, but I know there's more questions. So if you all want to join us in the Commons studio, you can bring your questions up there. Let's give another round of applause for Elizabeth.